our next speaker has presented here a few times, and every year everybody's just kind of saying, when's he coming back? How do I learn more? Energy Innovations, Dr. Greg Reed is coming up, and we're supporting energy innovations today, tomorrow, the future. So, Dr. Reed. You got about 25 minutes now.
I can do it.
Questions.
Sure. I'll try to be brief as well. Thank you, Phil. It's a pleasure to be back again this year. I really look forward to this event, and I apologize for always overdressing. I show up here in a tie and a suit jacket, and for the life of me, I don't know why. Old habits die hard, I guess. And the other thing I did, the engineer in me wanted to call you guys kinetic energy and not connect energy, so I apologize for misspelling that. But what I wanted to talk about today is a little bit of what's going on in terms of some clean energy goals and what we're looking at from an infrastructure point of view, using our own region, Pittsburgh, and some partnerships that we've developed with Scandinavian countries, primarily Denmark and Sweden, and other European countries in terms of how do we start to move forward. And so I think a lot of it are based around the themes that we just heard about in terms of where energy resources are beginning to shift, and in particular what we're trying to do more so from getting to these goals of potentially 100% renewable, zero emissions, and how do we get there? So one of the things that we've been working on is a big effort around district energy systems, which I think is a whole new definition today. Historically, and I think traditionally, we've always defined district energy primarily as combined heat and power systems, CHP plants. That definition is beginning to expand because as we begin to look at local infrastructures, we start to see the potential beyond just CHP into fully grown microgrids and everything around that, from a complete energy portfolio, from financing to infrastructure, and what that means in terms of security, and especially in terms of the environmental aspect and the goals that we have to try to reduce emissions, reduce greenhouse gases. So we've been working on a partnership with the city of Pittsburgh, the Department of Energy, a little bit with the state, and again, some aspects that I'll get to a little bit later with our friends in Scandinavia, of how do we start to drive some of that, and how do we demonstrate how these systems can work together, what technologies need to be built into it, and where do we begin to move these things forward, not only to demonstrate and deploy them, but to really become a leader in the country around what we're doing in a smart way with energy resources and energy deployment. So one of the things that we've looked at, first of all, with this partnership was to see sort of where we are in terms of goals. And I won't go through all of this, and I'll leave the presentation behind if anybody wants to dig into the details. But the state of Pennsylvania, like a lot of states, regardless of what the new administration has looked at in terms of debunking the Clean Power Plan and some other things, has had some pretty strong, or at least the beginnings of some strong renewable energy portfolio standards and goals. So Pennsylvania, for example, is looking to reduce emissions by 24% by 2030. Right now, we get about 40% of our generation from nuclear, and that is in jeopardy. I'll talk about that a little bit later, as what was just mentioned. A lot still from coal, and an increasing portion from natural gas. And the coal-natural gas thing continues to interchange as the years go on. And you see some other things that we're looking at. But our portfolio standard says that we need to get to about 20% by 2021, and we're a little bit behind on that. So some things that we have to do. And so we started to look at what do we start to do, and how can our region, the Pittsburgh region, southwestern Pennsylvania, historically a national and even global leader in energy resource development, technologies, infrastructure, begin to sort of show the country how you begin to move in this direction. So one of the things we started with was going back to where, what's our baseline? While the state sort of has a portfolio, if you look at our region, and when I say our region, there's something called the Power of 32 region that some of you may have heard of. It's a 32-county area, including Allegheny, Butler, Armstrong, et cetera, over into southeastern Ohio, northern Western Virginia, Maryland. And we did an energy baseline, basically a Sankey diagram of our resources. And as you might expect, it was predominantly coal, but if you look at the purple line, quite a bit from nuclear as well, which is where we get a lot of our carbon emission reduction goal targets through that nuclear piece. Now what's beginning to change, this was done in 2014, is that there's certainly less coal, but still a high predominance of coal in this region, in the Power of 32. and more natural gas, so more of the bottom green one going up into where we produce our electricity. But we still export a lot of energy, more from natural gas now, but still a lot from coal. So how do we look at that and say, we've got to do some things in terms of doing better with our clean energy portfolios, the infrastructures that we need to build around it. So we established a program called the District and Energy Initiative, initially with the city of Pittsburgh, and working with the National Energy Technology Lab, the local DOE lab, on how we begin to look at different opportunities around microgrids to do really what I would say are these primary things. One is to improve the sustainability of the energy resource portfolio. Number two is to continue to maintain, at least, if not improve, reliability. Those are two very important goals. So working very closely, with Duquesne Light, with Peoples Gas, the utilities, and others involved in this, to make sure that we meet those standards. But then at the same time, improving resiliency and security. Those are the two new things that are starting to become more important, whether it's to communities, whether it's industrial parks, whether it's college campuses, hospitals, whatever you look at as you start to define more local grids and more local infrastructures. Security and resiliency are the two new things that we need to start to build into this. And you take those four things, sustainability, reliability, security, and resiliency, and try to contain or maintain the strong economics around affordable electricity, it becomes a big challenge. So we looked at the city of Pittsburgh, and through a bunch of benchmarking, and I'll get through a little bit of how we did that, we looked at different neighborhoods, some of which had natural geographic boundaries or business boundaries, like the Golden Triangle downtown, or Oakland, where the universities are, other areas of the city that might have vulnerabilities, like the Hill District, and said, let's look at how those can be microgrids. But not just look at them as completely independent. They all need to have grid interconnection, but how do we actually come up with something more unique that what other cities are doing, which is a grid of microgrids? So keeping these all tied together so that they can share resources, share infrastructure in terms of reliability and things like that. So one of the big questions that we began to ask is, where do we need to put our infrastructure? First of all, where does the power come from? If we're going to build microgrids, how do we put a whole bunch of resources in downtown? Well, we probably don't, although there is some ways to begin to do that. Where do we get that from? How do we share it? Where do the lines go? Where do the pipes go, et cetera? So we started to look at this grid of microgrids, and I won't go into this in detail, but the big thing was around really looking at it from an overall energy environment portfolio. So looking at what the physical infrastructure would look like, again, the mix of resources, and how do you optimize that? How much solar, how much potential wind, how much natural gas, whatever it might be, can you put into these systems? And what's the optimization between costs, carbon reduction goals that you have, again, meeting reliability, and trying to come up with something that defines a microgrid. So a lot of our work has been, and I was talking to Tom about this earlier, around planning these systems, doing the initial studies, doing the initial energy envelope around what the options are, how do I optimize them, where do the potential costs come into play, and then what are the driving benefits. I could define something that's, and design it as an engineer, that's 100% renewable, has beautiful sustainability targets, has a huge reduction in carbon emissions, but is unaffordable to anybody that would have to pay rent in a facility around a microgrid like that, for example. So what's the trade-offs? What am I going to trade off? Am I going to trade off emissions for economics? Am I going to trade off security for economics? Where do we get the right point to make it affordable? There's a lot of new developments. One that we're just starting to get involved in right now, and I'll go through some other examples because I don't have it on the slide, is the old Mellon Arena site that the Penguins have been holding on to and collecting parking revenues for the last 8 years. They finally have to build on that site. They have 2 years left to get some infrastructure built, and so there's a huge plan, you may have seen it in the news, around mixed-use entertainment, commercial buildings, offices, mixed housing, et cetera. And so we're looking at that site and saying, what do we do here? What are the options? What are the trade-offs between, these different things? And so our goal or our role has been to sort of define what these begin to look like in terms of an overall energy envelope, all right? So won't go through this in much detail, but a lot of these projects, again, started in a planning stage or kind of moving up the ramp into either how do we get them financed, which is a big question. When you start to get into the area of microgrids, a big question around it is, where's the financing coming from? Who's investing in it? et cetera. How do we make this affordable? Because when a developer comes in, like what they're going to do at the old Civic Arena site, and these developers start to put the plans together to build their buildings and price out what rent is going to be, whether it's for a residential unit or commercial space, they need to fill that space. They need to be able to lease it out. They need to make, some revenue. And so we're looking at how does that happen, and where do we go in terms of the planning all the way through to implementation. So we have a bunch of projects that are in play. I'll give you an example of what some of those are, including the one, again, where the old Mellon Arena site was, all in different stages of either development or now beginning to be implemented. So again, the grid of microgrids was the concept. A few projects that have already been sort of underway and a couple that have been built. One is one you've already heard about, so I won't repeat it. We talked about our new lab at the Energy Innovation Center in downtown Pittsburgh, actually on the other side of the old Mellon Arena from where PPG Arena is now. So we've built our own microgrid and our own power lab that you've heard about in past years from me presenting at the Energy Innovation Center. So our solar installation is going in now. It's about a 50 kilowatt installation. It's not huge, but we're tying that into our new power infrastructure. We have vertical wind turbines on the site, natural gas on site. So we've created a real microgrid around that at about a total capacity of 1 megawatt. So it's pretty significant, and we'll be using that as our new research lab. We've been working with Duquesne Light on their Woods Run plan. That hasn't been implemented yet because, like many of these things, it's held up in Public Utility Commission decisions. The PUC still doesn't quite know how to handle microgrids, especially when a utility is involved. An unintended consequence of deregulation of the 90s. We've done a couple of projects for Pitt Ohio Express, a great project of wind, solar, and battery storage at their Harmer Distribution Center, and we're working on a big one, about 500 kilowatts, in a similar way at a new distribution system in Ohio. And then what's now called the Hazelwood Green site, where Uber and some of these other organizations are setting up some facilities. And what we started to do is look around beyond that and say, again, how do we come up with this grid of microgrids? So one of the things that went into our planning was a little bit of a heat mapping of vulnerability. So I won't go into this in detail, but it was basically looking at everything from where are existing infrastructures, what's been the historic status of outages and other things, where do some of these places sit, physically, whether it's, along a river that's prone to flooding, what are the socioeconomic advantages or disadvantages of things. And so from that, you can see some heat mapping around different ways of looking at where our biggest vulnerabilities are and how do we begin to address those in terms of building on those themes, again, of security, resiliency, reliability, sustainability, and start to look at those maybe as potential areas to demonstrate some microgrids. One of the things I'll say is that when you start to look at this more, this is an area that really, from a socioeconomic status, is very difficult to work out. And I think we need to get this right in terms of policy and regulation, both at the state and at the local level. It's usually organizations who have the deeper pockets that can put solar panels on the roof of their buildings and benefit from that offtake and the reduction in the energy bill from the utility. Who gets left paying the bill is residents of a neighborhood, say like the Hill District, that don't have the economic feasibility to be able to put those installations in, and then they have to add to the shared cost of the distribution system that doesn't go away. And so we need to figure this out in terms of how we make this much more economically viable for everyone. We have to keep electricity affordable. So what we've done is we brought together a lot of key stakeholders around the city, some industry partners, as well as, again, the DOE, the city itself, and then the utilities to make sure that they were at the table, because as all of you know, all these things are still somewhat controversial with where the utilities participate or don't participate in them. The fact of the matter is, though, when you start to talk about microgrids or even CHP plants, somewhere along the way, you are touching or impacting their infrastructure. And if you don't have them constructively and positively at the table, that's going to be a harder thing to work through than an easier thing to work through. So in my experience, especially with any projects we're working with, where it involves the utility some way, shape, or form, get them to the table early. I think what you'll find is actually Duquesne Light and Peoples Gas, I think we're fortunate. They've been proactively positive about this, which isn't something that you've seen in other parts of the country. The utility has become more of the antagonist around some of these things than they have been a positive partner. So at least for now, the environment is good, and we hope to continue that. I'll skip through some of these things, but again, financing, I actually think there are people in this room that understand this a lot better than me. But how do we begin, to finance this? Is it through green bonds? Is it through reinsurance? Is it, these big developers coming in and saying, hey, there's a profitable model here that I can look at in investing in this microgrid and in, the renewable technologies, and I can get some lower electricity or thermal pricing out of this and pass that on as a profit to me and my shareholders or partners. We haven't seen a whole lot of that yet. There's probably a role here for public-private partnerships, but I think one of the things that's been holding back the growth of the microgrid market to an extent is where the financing comes from, because it is a bit of a risk right now. Just an example of some of the other projects that we have going on. So one down at the 2nd Avenue Garage, looking at making 2nd Avenue from downtown out to the Biotech Center, sort of an electric avenue with all-electric busing and everything like that, so that could be exciting. The city of Pittsburgh has been talking about consolidating all of their shared services, police, fire, ambulance, et cetera, emergency services at the old Highland Park VA site. And so we've done a big energy analysis around that, again, to sort of show them what the potential is and where they can optimize. Our new lab and our new operations at the Energy Innovation Center are, in the Lower Hill District, so we're working with our neighbors there, a lot of the community organizations in the Hill, around trying to define what would a microgrid look like for the Hill District, and is there an economic viable pathway, for the residents of the Hill to get there. And then a few others. We just completed a project in Millville at the old Moose Club, solar, battery storage, all through our concept of direct current, which I've talked about before, with the LED lighting and some of the other loads that are in the building, including a small data server farm. So that's been fun. The old Moose Lodge is now a very vibrant community center in the Millville district, in the Millville town, in what's being called the Energy Eco-Vation District, which is Millville, Etna, and Sharpsburg. So this is one of the first projects that they've done. And if you've been following news, the Pittsburgh Airport has been talking for a while of a big energy development out there, not just a microgrid, but beyond that, looking at what I would call a fairly significant light industrial / commercial park, largely associated with tapping the natural gas that's out there and building the plants right there at the site. And that's important, because when you get into what starts to happen with the total renewable portfolio, there's a lot of challenges. We all know this, of course, about how intermittent, variable, diurnal, solar and wind can be. And so how do we mix this in and do it in a smart way and still get to some of these emissions goals? So that's one of the things we really need to work a lot better on. And this is where we've gone to starting to work with some of our partners in other parts of the world. And I'll skip through this. This is a little bit more on the DC concept of this. As you start to look at very quickly what I've talked about before at this meeting, our end use of electricity, most of what we use today only needs a few volts DC. We don't need 120 volts, 3-phase, 60 hertz for much of anything anymore. And so there's a mismatch that's been developing very quietly over the last decade or more of how we generate and deliver electricity and how we use it. So going to more all DC infrastructure makes more sense today. We reduce the losses, increase the efficiency, because solar produces an inherent DC output, batteries are inherently natural DC technologies, and all the end-use devices, of course, are DC as well. So we're trying to make a better match in what we're doing. So we have to start to look at this. And one of the other things that fits into this, by the way, again, if you're following this, the Pittsburgh region, sadly, as much as we've cleaned up our industrial past and our steel heritage and the old smoky days of 3 in the afternoon on a summer day, it looked like it was midnight in Pittsburgh with all the smoke and the clouds, we are still the 3rd worst metropolitan area in the country when it comes to air quality. So we're not doing real well there, and we still have a long ways to go. So we're trying to improve that. And so how do we become better? So this is where some of the benchmarking and the partnerships come into play. We need to bring in some innovation. We need to bring in some new ideas. So why not learn from others that are doing this as well? So I just got back from 2 weeks to beginning of May from the third year in a row of doing a study abroad class with about 20 of our students in the Swanson School of Engineering, where we go to Denmark and Sweden. We base our time in Denmark out of Copenhagen, our time in Sweden out of Stockholm, and we learn how these Scandinavian countries are very, very progressively and rapidly getting to these goals of 100% renewable energy for electricity production, at least, and other larger goals, and how they're doing it with renewables, with trade-offs, with other things that they're doing. So these are just statistics. I'll get to some other ones that are a little bit more interesting. But what we did is we signed a partnership last year with the Danish Embassy. My program, the Pitt Energy Grid Institute, the city of Pittsburgh there with the mayor, and then the ambassador to the U.S., Lars, and I forget Lars's last name, I apologize, came up from Washington, D.C. to sign an agreement where what we're going to do is, and what we've been doing for the past year and a half, is sharing best practices between what they do in cities like Copenhagen, which is a global leader in terms of a city, in terms of moving to clean energy, biking infrastructure, all of that, and how we can start to apply some of those best practices. Now, ideally, the partnership is that we learn from each other. As I told the ambassador when we met him last year, embarrassingly, this is going to be a one-way street for a while. I think we're going to learn a lot more from them and what they do than the other way around. But, you know, we do have some things here that we think we can contribute over there. So the whole goals of this are really to exchange the experiences, in particular in Denmark, but also other Scandinavian and Nordic countries, with what we need to do to begin to demonstrate and deploy some of this around these larger goals that we started to already define, you know, going back several years with this Pittsburgh grid of microgrids. And it's kind of exciting because talking to Tom, it sounds like at least Direct Energy is already involved in some of the early implementation stages of projects that the city is beginning to move forward on that we help sort of define. So what comes next is, you know, we've planned out a project, we've done some analysis and optimization, we've maybe approved it in terms of the goals we want to achieve. Now let's move into implementation. If we implement, how do we bring these best innovative practices in here? Let's not just do it the same way. Let's not build buildings and wire them all with 120 volts, three-phase AC anymore if that doesn't make sense, and there are better innovative technological ways to do it. Let's take advantage of where we can use thermal heating that's cheaper today than other ways. Or why don't we start to look at going all electric? Because if we produce all the electricity from clean sources, then we have a complete clean energy portfolio, including where we get our thermal heating and cooling from. So these are all things that are beginning to at least be looked into in terms of practice when we go to implement, whether it's, again, a new site like the old Civic Arena site or the Mellon Arena site, or a retrofit of old facilities, which has become pretty vogue as well over the years. So this just sort of defines what the roles have been. I'll sort of skip through that, but I will say this, the Danes have been great to work with. One of the things that I've learned over the last 3 years with this class that I've done, and this is a picture of our students, we go out to the Middle Grunden wind farm, which you can see very clearly from the downtown Copenhagen skyline, which at first, just like in the US, was very controversial. Copenhageners didn't want, or I guess I should say the Danes didn't want these wind turbines to be seen off the coast of their skyline. That was way back, 15 years ago when the plans were being developed. They worked very hard to make it look good, put it in line with, some historic defense islands that they had put in back in the war years, etc. Today, the Danes are proud of this. They can't imagine their skyline being complete without the wind turbines in the back of it. So they like to show pictures of their skyline from the other side of the city, looking at their buildings and the wind turbines in the background, rather than from up front on the coast, just looking at the buildings. So it's amazing how the cultural shift begins to take place. So this project has really helped us, or this class has helped us come back with the ideas, and as you might imagine, the enthusiasm and the excitement of a bunch of, young 20-year-olds who see their future, much differently as I look around than most of us in the room anyways, in terms of really, really being committed to what's going on here. And if you spend some time in these other cities, you see it right away. The first thing you see when you get to Copenhagen is everybody's on a bicycle. And they rule. The bikes rule over pedestrians and over vehicles and everything else. In the morning, there are bicycle traffic jams on the bike paths. It's an incredible culture that we'll probably never get to in most places in the United States, but just moving in that direction is incredible. I think 80% now of all Copenhagen residents own a bicycle for sure, that they use to commute to work with, and I think the commuter level penetration is like 75%. They want to get it to almost 100%. Copenhagen wants to essentially ban commuter vehicles from the city by like 2030. Only commercial vehicles for deliveries of goods and services in the future. So anyways, we learn a lot. And these are some of the things that we learn. Number one, Denmark is headed down this path. They already have 42% wind penetration on a daily basis, average, in their system. They've had many days, and increasingly more days, where 100% of electricity in Denmark comes from wind energy. Over 100%, and they're exporting it on really, really good wind days. But on average, they're at 42% base load. That's the minimum that they'll have. Any given day, they'll have 42%. The rest of it, they're making up from carbon neutral biomass and waste to energy, which is a huge commitment that they have. And then about 30% hydro. They don't have a lot of their own, so a lot of it is imported from Norway and Sweden. In the Scandinavian countries, solar doesn't work so well, but as the costs keep coming down, it starts to make sense to just put it up, because even if you only get it for a few months in the summertime, shorter sunny days in the wintertime, it's starting to make sense to do a little bit of that. They do a lot with thermal solar for district heating systems. And so that's one of the things that we've never really done much as a culture here. We produce electricity, and the emissions go up into the atmosphere. They capture it, turn that heat into hot water-based systems that are run through their communities for district heating and cooling of their homes and businesses. It's a model that they've had for years, that the community and the citizens buy into, that again, either culturally or from a policy point of view, we don't even have the models around the U.S. to build. So one of the things that we want to try to do here in Pittsburgh is bring some of that knowledge and capability here. Sweden is a little bit different, but still heading down the same path. Denmark, by the way, wants to be electricity production fossil-free by 2050. Sweden is even further ahead of them. They want to get there by 2040. They already have about 40% hydro. They can increase some hydro, about another 10% of production, so they want to get to about 50% hydro. Increase their wind, which is only 5% right now, but their wind potential is as good as Denmark's. They want to get that up to about 25% by 2040. And then other sustainable sources, such as going to the combined heat and power plants with solar thermal as the main energy resource, as well as other solar, all while reducing their dependence on nuclear. Today, nuclear accounts for 30%, but if you start to add these numbers up, you get over 100% if you keep nuclear at 30% in the equation. So they have committed as a country to begin to decommission their nuclear fleet, not grow it or not even sustain it or extend it. So again, to the other presentation, there are countries who are at least setting some policy and moving forward with it in terms of where nuclear energy is, and Sweden is one of them. An example of a cool thing that they're all doing in the Scandinavian, I would say North European countries, is something called the North Sea Wind Power Hub. So huge wind power park with solar in there as well. High voltage DC lines extending out to Germany, to the UK, to Denmark, to Copenhagen. Really sort of a shared resource here, looking at about 150 gigawatts or more of North Sea wind. And so this is a concept, a picture of it, where you'd have an island out at sea, literally hundreds of wind turbines, solar panels, et cetera, all then being linked to the onshore through undersea submarine DC cables. I won't go through this. I've presented this before, but something we need to start to look at as well in the United States is how do we start to begin to tap our offshore wind. It's taken a long time, but we're finally beginning to develop some projects off of Massachusetts, off of New Jersey. There was a big decision about a month ago with the state of New Jersey allowing now developers to go offshore and to begin to bring those resources on land. And so those projects are just beginning to be developed. Sadly, where we're looking at, though, is many, many miles offshore. And so the costs for the interconnections are going to be high. and it may or may not make it as economically viable as we'd like to be. When you go to Europe, you go to what they're doing in the North Sea, again, what they're doing in Copenhagen, you can see those wind turbines from the shore. They're not so far out. It makes the interconnection a lot more viable and a lot more economic. So I'll close with this. We learn a lot, again, from our Scandinavian partners, what's going on in other parts of the world. How viable is it for the U.S.? The one thing you can say, and I say this, is, well, Denmark is one thing, right? They got 5 million people as a country, you know? Sweden, kind of the same thing. You can almost look at those countries as maybe one state in the U.S. Can one state in the U.S. get this right or develop these same sort of practices? Probably. Can we do it as a nation? Is there a national goal? Is there a North American goal with our other partners, Canada and Mexico? You know, maybe we can do it, maybe we can't. I think it's a huge challenge, you know, politically and otherwise, of course. But there are ways to do it. One is that we need to be more aggressive and incentivize more our expansion of renewable resources, and that's not just solar rooftop, you know, applications. That's gigawatt scale, like they're doing in these other countries, of solar and wind, both onshore and offshore. I think we need to recognize that natural gas plays a huge role. It's taken the place of coal and continues to increase. It is a cleaner fossil-burning fuel, but it remains a fossil-burning fuel. If you look at the projections from the DOE, coal doesn't go to zero anytime soon. Even though we keep shutting plants down, we're still going to be with some coal plants for quite a number of years, maybe at least a decade or more. So, you know, we've got to understand that that is very important for renewable growth, because right now it gives us the dispatchable load generation that we don't quite have, or don't have the high enough penetrations around the renewables to be able to make our grid very reliable. And I question why we have uncommitted from looking at carbon capture and sequestration. If this country is so committed to continuing to burn fossil fuels and dig for them and everything else, then why aren't we at least looking at the back end of how do we control the emissions that are coming from them? I think we need to get back to that in a very aggressive way. And I do agree that I think nuclear plays a huge part in this. When you look at a clean energy portfolio, we talked about the state of Pennsylvania alone is 40%. If we decommission 3 Mile Island and Beaver Valley, which looks like it's going to happen, all of those carbon emission goals completely dissolve. We get so much of our greenhouse gas emission numbers from the nuclear fleet that we might as well give up in terms of those goals if we shut those 2 plants down. But they've become too expensive to operate in the face of natural gas and other competition. So we have to make a decision. What's it worth to have a clean energy portfolio and have nuclear play in a role in it? At least countries like Germany, Sweden, France, one way or another, have made a decision. We have no decision. We have no policy. We don't know what we're doing. we're shutting down. We've built 1 or 2, looking to extend life. It's hard. I do think the big thing, though, is our continued reduction, as was presented earlier, on liquid fuels in the transportation sector. I think the growth of electric vehicles and electric transportation in general is going to be the biggest game changer of all. I worry, though, about the battery technologies. I think we're creating a new environmental waste issue. I also think that economically we're not quite there with battery storage, especially for grid scale. I'm not sure we're going to get there. I think it's starting to hit that sort of plateau that superconductivity did, where we had a lot of exponential reduction in everything, costs, viability, you know, you name it, and then it sort of plateaued, and you don't see conductivity in the equation anymore. Storage is starting to get there. It's still many times more expensive than the generation capacity itself. So when you start to put storage into some of these projects, the larger scale they are, you start to lose the economic viability of them. Maybe not so much, again, for a residential application with a Tesla wall concept, but when we get to the gigawatts, the economics don't pencil out very well. So I think we have to worry about where storage is going and what some of the alternatives are to that. And then finally, since I'm an electrical engineer, I think part of the answer is electrify everything, provide the electricity all from clean energy resources, and maybe we can get there. So I hope that was a little bit informative, some new things than what we've presented in the past, some examples of what we're doing with our friends in Scandinavia. And I thank you for your attention. I appreciate being here. Thank you.
Any questions? Anybody for Dr. Reed?
Yes, there's one back
Bill,
there.
way in the back.
Uh-huh. That's a great question. To be honest, personally, I haven't looked into that yet, but you bring up a good point that I didn't mention. The nuclear waste still remains an issue, right? We don't have a refuel use like they do in France. I think it could be very viable. Whether or not it's economic, I don't know. I haven't looked at it. It would be great if we could get that right, though, for sure.
Karen? Can you step up? We can't hear you here.
Oh, what is Canada doing? Great question. Actually, Canada's not unlike us. They're sort of political in a tug of war between fossil and renewables. If anything, they're continuing to increase their hydro production, which I think is good because they start to look a lot more like Sweden. They're looking at building higher penetrations of transmission infrastructure. A lot of Canada's connection to the U.S. is north to south. There are big hydro plants in Quebec and up in British Columbia, coming down into the northeast and into the far northwest, have been a big part of their transmission infrastructure. And then in the middle of Manitoba, Nelson River, they have huge hydro resources. So you go across Canada in three big places, the far east, the middle, and the far west, and a lot of those resources serve Canada and then come down into the U.S. But they're looking at trying to become a little bit more independent on higher penetrations of hydro and building more of a east to west DC grid across Canada to basically become more sustainable, but then also provide the potential to continue to import more and more into the U.S. I think what they see is we'll continue to shut down more of our fossil plants, and while a lot of the growth replacing that will be from natural gas and renewables, I think they realize that hydro still can be a cheaper and more reliable baseload source for the United States, and I think that's been more of their policy.
Any last questions? Other than Will?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on your goals. If you're looking at new infrastructure build, right, and let's take it away from the United States, and you're going to parts of the world that still aren't electrified. 17% of the world still doesn't have access to electricity. I'm not sure everybody knows that. Billions of people that still don't have electricity. So you're not going to build a grid and a distribution network, in a new African, in an African village where you're looking at new power or something like that. You're going to go to these microgrids, and for sure we're going to reduce costs by just going directly to this sort of distributed end of it. In the U.S., where we've already got so much of an infrastructure built, almost all of these want to have a grid interconnection. I think we will save in not having to build additional distribution facilities, especially for greenfield projects, if we put the resources on site. But I also don't look at that as the big driving economic factor of it. That's more of a reliability measure.
Thanks, Dr. Reed.
All right, thank you. Pleasure. Thanks, Phil.
Great stuff. Let's take a 10-15 minute break and